When you come across this video, you might very well become one of the first pioneers to set foot on Mars. Because NASA has once again officially announced that within 10 years, human footprints will appear for the first time on that planet covered in red dust. This isn't science fiction, it's a real plan that NASA is advancing step by step. But here's the question, is Mars really suitable for us? The moment you step onto Mars, what kind of harsh environment will you encounter? What challenges, never before experienced by humans on Earth, will you face? And what astonishing technologies will NASA use to help us survive on that cold, dry, and dead planet? Don't worry, in this video I will take you to see for yourself all the truths you must understand before humanity colonizes Mars. Obviously, to colonize Mars, you first have to get there safely. Under the best launch conditions, it takes about 9 months to fly from Earth to Mars. That might not sound too long like taking a cruise, but you must not overlook one thing. These 9 months are not spent under the protective umbrella of Earth's magnetic field, but are nakedly exposed to the solar wind and cosmic radiation. Long-term exposure to this radiation is very likely to cause astronauts to develop cancer, and may even cause early symptoms of Alzheimer's disease before you even reach Mars. Sounds a bit scary, right? But don't worry too much. NASA has long considered protective measures. For example, adding hydrogen-rich materials to the spacecraft's shell, or even wrapping the entire cabin with water tanks, because water itself contains a large amount of hydrogen. Of course, there are even cooler ideas, like creating an artificial magnetic field around the spacecraft to completely block out the radiation. But the problem is, to realize this vision, you need a small nuclear reactor to provide enormous energy. At the current level of technology, this is not yet very feasible. However, when you finally arrive at Mars, you might be surprised to find that Mars is not as unfamiliar as you imagined. Earth and Mars actually have many similarities. For example, the most obvious common point is that the length of a day on Mars is not much different from Earth's, about 24 hours, 39 minutes, and 35 seconds. A year on Mars is a bit longer than Earth's, about 1.88 Earth years, which is 687 Earth days. But this is normal for a planet with a larger orbit, farther from the Sun. In the entire solar system, the seasonal changes on Mars are the most similar to Earth's. This is because Mars's rotational axis tilt is almost the same as Earth's. Earth's is 23.5 degrees and Mars's is 25 degrees. What does this mean? It means Mars also experiences seasons similar to Earth's spring, summer, autumn, and winter. But the temperature changes on Mars are more extreme, ranging from a high of 35 degrees Celsius in the summer at the equator to a low of minus 143 degrees Celsius at the polar ice caps in winter. The difference is huge. And similar to Earth, Mars also has north and south polar ice caps. Every winter, the polar regions enter a long, dark night. But unlike Earth, the winter on Mars is so cold that it can even freeze the atmosphere into dry ice, which is solid carbon dioxide. This dry ice accumulates on the surface of the ice caps, but the ice caps themselves are still mainly composed of water ice. The size of Mars's ice caps also changes with the seasons. You can even see the huge changes in the ice caps from winter to summer through short videos. By the way, I personally particularly like a small detail on Mars, the mysterious spiral patterns on the surface of the polar ice caps. Scientists believe these beautiful patterns are actually caused by the Coriolis effect. But the dry ice on the ice caps doesn't stay there forever. When this dry ice sublimates, turning directly from a solid to a gas, it triggers a violent reaction that affects the entire planet, dust storms. If you just look at photos, you might mistakenly think the surface of Mars is very calm, with nothing but dust and scattered rocks. But if you were to stay for a while, you would soon see a huge, thick wall of dust rising on the horizon. You might think it's similar to a sandstorm on Earth, but you can't even imagine the scale of this storm. In fact, it engulfs not just one region, not even just one continent, but the entire planet. This kind of global superdust storm erupts about once every 3 Martian years, which is about every 5.5 Earth years. Once it appears, the sky-high dust will completely block the sunlight for weeks or even months. If humanity really wants to settle on Mars in the future, this kind of superdust storm is definitely a huge obstacle. And what's more troublesome is that, to this day, we are still not entirely clear about the cause of these superdust storms. However, It's worth mentioning that Mars didn't always have these global dust storms. Billions of years ago, it had a thick atmosphere, and its surface was even warm enough to support the flow of liquid water. But over the long years, Mars gradually dried up, and its atmosphere slowly escaped. Now, its atmospheric density is less than 1% of Earth's. It's important to note that the dust storms on Mars didn't suddenly start appearing because it became dry. Although we haven't fully understood the cause of these storms, scientists speculate that an important factor may be the extreme temperature changes on Mars. Mars's thin atmosphere cannot effectively retain heat. Once the sun sets, the surface temperature drops sharply. To take an extreme example, when you are standing on the Martian equator, the temperature at your feet might be a warm 23 degrees Celsius, but the temperature at your head might be only 0 degrees Celsius. It is this drastic temperature difference between day and night that causes strong winds. But unlike Earth, the weather cycle on Mars is not driven by water but by dust. The dust on Mars is extremely important. Without this dust, global dust storms might not even occur. At this point, you might be curious, how does the dust get into the air? In fact, there are many mechanisms on Mars. One of the most common is the dust devil. Mars has thousands of dust devils every year, especially in the spring and summer. The sun's heat causes the air near the ground to rise rapidly, forming a low-pressure area. The surrounding cold air rushes in to fill the gap, spiraling upwards, forming a dust devil. Sometimes, a dust devil can be hundreds of meters wide and up to 8.5 kilometers high, like a giant vacuum cleaner, sucking the dust from the ground into the air. In addition to dust devils, a more common way is a phenomenon called saltation that occurs when the wind blows over the ground. The dust particles on Mars have static electricity and are difficult to be blown up. Instead, the larger sand grains are more easily moved by the wind. But when the large particles are blown up and fall back down, they act like small hammers hitting the ground, causing the finer dust to fly into the air. Once this dust enters the atmosphere, Mars's low gravity allows them to stay there for a long time, even long enough to fuel the next big storm. Once the dust enters the air, it can absorb the sun's heat and release it into the atmosphere. This further strengthens the formation of wind. As the wind gets stronger, it sends more dust into the air, eventually forming regional or even global superdust storms. The good news is that the wind speed of a Martian dust storm is at most about 97 kilometers per hour, about half that of a hurricane on Earth. Due to the thin air, such a wind blowing on a person wouldn't actually feel like much. The scenes in movies where spacecraft are blown over are basically impossible in reality. But then again, the real trouble with dust storms is not the wind, but the sky-high dust that completely blocks the sunlight. For example, in 2007, NASA's Opportunity rover encountered an unprecedented superdust storm on Mars. At that time, the sun's brightness dropped by 96%. For a rover that relies on solar power, this was extremely fatal. Opportunity's power supply was almost completely cut off, and it was even in danger of freezing. Fortunately, the storm gradually passed, and Opportunity finally survived. But not every rover is so lucky. In the same year, the Spirit rover also encountered the same problem. But its luck was much worse. A thick layer of dust slowly covered its solar panels, causing its power supply to continuously decline. Finally, it accidentally got stuck in a soft sand pit called Troy and never got out again, becoming a stationary research platform until its power completely ran out and it stopped working. These Martian dust storms can even affect the satellites orbiting Mars. Because the sky-high dust raises the temperature of the Martian atmosphere, the atmosphere begins to expand, entering the orbital region of the satellites, forcing them to expend precious fuel to maintain their correct orbital position. Imagine if you were a future Mars colonist and suddenly encountered such a global dust storm. The solar power supply system would be blocked, and humans could not survive for long in the extremely cold environment. Even communication with Earth would be cut off. At that time, you would be on your own. Fortunately, these superstorms will eventually lose their energy source because they block too much sunlight, preventing the surface from continuing to heat up. They will eventually dissipate naturally. Have you ever wondered what the wind blowing on Mars sounds like? Actually, you don't have to imagine it yourself. In 2018, NASA's InSight lander, using its built-in seismometer, actually recorded the sound of the wind on Mars. However, this sound is very low-pitched, so it's best to listen with headphones or a subwoofer. What's even cooler is that it not only recorded the sound of the wind, but also clearly captured the water ice clouds floating in the sky. This gave us our first real sense that the sky on Mars also has wind and clouds. Although the surface of Mars looks desolate today, there is indeed a small amount of water vapor in its atmosphere. But overall, the atmospheric environment on Mars is still very harsh. The conditions for direct human habitation simply do not exist. What about the soil on Mars? I believe many people have seen the movie The Martian. The protagonist, Watney, actually grew potatoes on Mars using its soil. Is such a thing really possible in reality? Is the soil on Mars suitable for growing things? Would plants grown on Mars be harmful to the human body if eaten? In fact, Martian soil does contain most of the nutrients needed for plant growth, but it also depends on the specific location. Just like on Earth, some places have fertile soil, while others are barren. But Martian soil is different from the soil we are familiar with. It's more like a pile of weathered rock that has not undergone long-term biological modification. In 2016, scientists tried to grow more than a dozen types of plants, including tomatoes, peas, spinach, and radishes, in simulated Martian soil on Earth. The results showed that these plants could indeed grow. The yield was slightly lower, but it was much better than expected. However, the premise was that some grass or other organic matter had to be added to the soil as fertilizer, otherwise these plants wouldn't last long. But there's another problem. Martian soil contains a large amount of calcium perchlorate. Consuming too much of this substance is toxic to the human body and can also harm the plants themselves. However, calcium perchlorate is not entirely useless. It can absorb moisture from the air and release oxygen. This is actually great news for future human colonization of Mars. In the future, when we grow plants on Mars, it's not just for food self-sufficiency, but also because fresh fruits and vegetables are rich in antioxidants, which can improve human mood and even help resist space radiation. So if you really want to become a qualified Martian farmer in the future, the soil problem is a key issue that must be solved. Of course, to survive on Mars for a long time, just knowing how to farm is not enough. You also need to use various advanced technologies to overcome the harsh environment on Mars, for example, Mars's thin atmosphere. In the past, people always thought it was impossible to fly in such a place. But NASA didn't believe in that. They built a small Mars helicopter named Ingenuity. It is particularly lightweight and uses carbon fiber blades. In just 3 years, it has successfully flown 72 times and taken many stunning photos of Mars. This proves that as long as technology is used in the right place, anything impossible can become possible. In addition to helicopters, there is an even cooler way to explore: sending in robots. You've probably heard of the Spirit, Opportunity, and Perseverance rovers, and even China's Zhurong rover. These rovers all have 6 wheels, are tall, and are suitable for long-distance exploration. But the problem is that they can easily get stuck in soft ground. For example, Spirit got stuck and never came out. At this point, the advantages of legged robots like Spot, developed by Boston Dynamics, become apparent. A 4-legged robot dog can not only easily climb over obstacles, but can also reach speeds of nearly 6 kilometers per hour. It has intelligent AI. You just tell it the destination, and it can plan the route itself. It can also autonomously avoid obstacles and even get back up if it falls. NASA even plans to send a team of robots like Spot in the future to autonomously explore the caves on Mars, because caves can well preserve precious information and may even preserve traces of microorganisms. Most importantly, caves can also effectively block radiation and may even become the best habitat for human colonization in the future. It's just that the environment of these caves is unknown and complex, and signals will be blocked by rocks. This requires the robots to have the ability to explore completely autonomously. But then again, the humans who will actually settle on Mars in the future must be completely self-sufficient. Think about it. Even making a phone call to Earth would take at least a few minutes, not to mention emergencies. No one can make decisions for you. You have to rely on yourself for everything. If the colonists successfully land on Mars, where will they live? It might be in the polar ice cap regions, or in a place like the Korolev crater. They might even choose to be near the underground permafrost layer. After choosing a location, they also have to build houses in advance using robots, for example using 3D printing technology to build houses directly from Martian soil mixed with water ice, and then covering them with a thick layer of soil to block radiation. When the colonists actually arrive, they also have to solve the supply of water, air, and food, for example, by producing oxygen through electrolysis of water, extracting drinking water from ice, and at the same time, growing crops. All of these together can form a truly self-sufficient colony. Of course, life on Mars will definitely not be easy. Staying in a confined space for a long time, getting along with the same few people every day, and a monotonous diet will cause great mental stress. And the low-gravity environment will also bring serious health problems, such as osteoporosis, muscle atrophy, and even affecting vision. However, despite the difficulties, every time NASA publicly recruits colonization volunteers, the applicants are still numerous. After watching all this, do you think humanity can ultimately establish a colony on Mars? Are you willing to be one of the first Mars explorers? Or have these difficulties already scared you away? In any case, this day may come sooner than you think, maybe even in our lifetime.